Welcome to our afternoon panel. Now show me how you'll raise them on translating poetry, a poetry born in translation, a conversation and the reading. The conversation is between Professor Peter Cole and Professor Ross Brann, which I'll briefly introduce and reintroduce in the case of Professor Brann, and a reading of poetry in Peter Cole's translation. I believe that anyone who has been reading Peter Cole's exquisite translations of Ibn Gabirol and of other poets knows how much it is a work of both desire and longing. As a work of desire, it shows how much he is kind of being enlivened by the poetry itself. And as a work of longing, it shows how much translation desires the original Hebrew language from which this poetry came. And we thank you both very much for agreeing to participate in this conversation and reading. I'm reintroducing Professor Ross Brann, who is Milton R. Convit's Professor of Judo-Islamic Studies and Stephen H. Weiss Presidential Fellow at Cornell University, where he taught since 1986 and served 20 years as the chair of the Department of Near Eastern Studies. He studied at the University of California, Berkeley, the Hebrew University, Jerusalem, New York University, and the American University in Cairo. Brann is the author and editor of books and essays on the intersection of Jewish and Islamic culture, including The Compunctious Poet, Power in Portrayal, and Iberian Moorings, which is the latest one, Al-Andalus and Sepharad, and the Tropes of Exceptionalism, out in UPenn Press 2021. Professor Peter Cole, a second. Professor Peter Cole divides his time between Jerusalem and New Haven, where he teaches at Yale each spring. His volumes of translation include the selected poems of Solomon Ibn Gabirol and The Dream of the Poem, Hebrew Poetry from Muslim and Christian Spain, 950 to 1492, both out in Princeton's Lockhart Library of Poetry and Translation, and the poetry of Kabbalah, mystical verse from the Jewish tradition, out in Yale University Press. His many honors include a Guggenheim Fellowship, the Jewish National Book Award, and an American Academy of Arts and Letters Award in Literature. He was named a MacArthur Fellow at 2007. His new book of poems, Draw Me After, will be published by Farrar, Straus and Giroux this fall. The framework of the next hour is we'll have 45 minutes of a conversation and reading between Professor Cole and Professor Brann, and then we'll have 15 minutes for discussion with the rest of us. Thank you both for coming to us, if only virtually. Please.
Thank you, Omer. Thank you, Ariel. This was truly some genius on your part to think of enlisting Peter in joining the group for a reading and a discussion of the layers of his translations, the work of translation. And so that's how we're going to frame our discussion. For Peter, translation is not just a philological practice, but he's deeply immersed in thinking about the act of translating, of the journey of a text in one language, both in form and content, into another language. So we're going to talk a bit about what we could loosely call his philosophy of translation, and then see how it applies to several of the poems that he's translated that he's chosen to read for us this afternoon, your time. So Peter, if you could start us with the different layers that you, in which you think of your work as a translator. You have expertise, obviously, in classical Arabic, in medieval Hebrew. You're a gifted poet in the English language in your own right. And so talk about what's involved in using the, let's say, the philological expertise and cultural literacy that you have to move that material into the English language. There are other translators of medieval Hebrew. I think the only one that I would even dare mention in the same breath is Ray Shinlin, and he, I think, considers himself a literary translator. And I like to think of you as that plus a poetic translator. So if you could just take us through some of the thinking that's behind how you do that, that would be a great way to start.
Okay, thank you, Russ. And thank you, Omar, for that beautiful introduction. First of all, it is really a great honor to be with you and also to see you out there. And I don't say that merely as a kind of academic pleasantry, but when I heard about this conference, 1,000 Years of Ibn Gabirol, that really goes to the heart of what makes me translate. The fact that 1,000 years later, this poetry is still speaking so powerfully to us in so many different ways, directly informs what I'm doing. And we'll get to some of that later. But also to be in conversation with Ross, and this too is substantive, not just flattery or pleasantry. But when I first began kind of foolishly trying to translate this work, or thinking that I might, I immediately I began with a kind of naivete and simplicity, thinking that as a poet I could just, although I actually wasn't much of a poet then either, that I could just do this. As certain American poets I know say, well, I don't speak X, but I speak the language of poetry, which I think is totally nonsense. I was still learning to be a poet. I was in my early 20s, mid-20s, really writing the first poems of mine that would be published and would matter in any way. And when I eventually, so I put aside what I started doing and went back to it only in my, I think I was about 30, late 20s, early 30s. And when I did, I suddenly realized, all right, I knew much more now about Hebrew than I had at the beginning when I began in that kind of naive way. But I didn't really know very much about the world all around this poetry. And Ross's book was his first book was one of the first things I encountered in English that really made me believe, I'm not just deluded in reading this poetry. It's not all my projection that this is as incredible and fascinating and complex and emerging with a kind of simplicity, but at its heart complex as I was thinking. So I mention that, as I say, because one of my favorite artists, especially when I was starting out around that time, was Barnett Newman, the American painter. And he's famous for, among other things, saying that aesthetics is to artists what ornithology is to the birds. And the translator is a little bit of both. He's part ornithologist, part bird. And as a translator of poetry and a translator of great poetry, of course, I want to fly. But you can't fly, and especially not with this poetry, without knowing something what the ornithologist does. So my own work has been as enmeshed with the history of scholarship, Arabic, Hebrew scholarship around this field, also the scholarship around the visual arts, we'll talk about that, as it has been enmeshed with the history of English poetry, and especially the history of translation into English. And arguably, it's not much of a stretch at all for any of you who know about English poetry. The history of English poetry is, in a sense, the history of importing various things from other places. So all of that, Ross, I would say, are kind of behind the layers of what I'm doing in sort of macro sense, and in the more specialized micro sense, and why I thought it would be interesting to kind of frame our talk today or our conversation today around the idea of translating a poetry born in translation. By that I meant both, even on the English side of the ledger, what I'm doing is born in a kind of all expression as being a kind of translation, expression from silence. Freud said our mother tongue is foreign, right? It comes to us from outside, which is a pretty profound thing, you think about it. But also because of the obvious layers of Greek and Arabic learning and poetry and prosody and all the things that go into the poetry that you've all been talking about today. So it really is an honor to be with you. I'm sorry I missed yesterday's talks, but it's been fascinating so far. And these are the things you were talking about this morning. In fact, are very much looking at it from the literary point of view, a more poetic point of view, let's say. But these are the things that are on my mind. And yeah.
Great. So yesterday evening, Sarah reminded us of something that I think everyone who's ever thought about this period and this place and the Jews' place in Al-Andalus knows, but doesn't often fully consider, and that is that for the poets themselves, their writing of this poetry in Hebrew was an act of translation, right, because they're thinking in Arabic. Not only are they connoisseurs of Arabic poetry, but their mother tongue is Arabic, and Hebrew is very dear to them, and clearly they've memorized the entire Tanakh and much of rabbinic literature and all of the apparatuses around that. And yet it's still a secondary language, a very special and different kind of secondary language, in some way unique to them. And so there's a very interesting dialectical relationship between what you're doing and the position of the poets themselves in producing this poetry.
Yeah, so I think the issue at the heart of that is the whole question of secondariness, derivation. Is coming later, is being secondary and derived in a certain way lesser? And if we think of it as lesser, are we to think of these Hebrew poets as writing somehow in some sort of stilted, non-natural, non-native idiom? And reading the poetry, that's exactly the opposite of what my experience of reading that poetry is. So I think one of the really first sort of epiphanies I had in reading this poetry was, how is it possible for a poetry that is so thickly layered with derivation, as you say, from Hebrew, from the Arabic, into a Hebrew that's not spoken day to day? How is it possible for that to be so phenomenally expressive? And for me, again, as that sort of young poet who was starting out, to be expressive in ways that no other poetry I had encountered was expressive, and expressive in relation to my own sort of thoughts about poetry and Jewishness and other things. So that was the lesson, sort of the penny drop there, that we're thinking, at least in the American context, we think a little too naively about the purity of the native, or the how shall we say, the value of the pure, because here you have these Hebrew writers who are trying to write in a pure Hebrew, with the notion of purity itself being taken from Arabic, and then that purity mixed with so much hybridity coming from all these other branches of learning and literature that we've talked about, and all that producing this incredibly expressive verse. So it made me realize, I need to think very, very differently about the ways in which coming coming after. So this, my new book of poems called Draw Me After, obviously from Song of Songs, but there's being drawn after, and Omar talked about this kind of longing in translation, I think is a central dynamic to poetry, period. And increasingly I've come to think of all poetry as that kind of deep translation. Borges has a marvelous statement. Of course, it's Borges, so he can get away with these things. But he says, in the story Pierre Menard, when Menard translates Cervantes exactly word for word certain chapters, which are all chapters almost all about translation, and then so Borges gives you the original Cervantes, and then he gives you the original. Or he gives you the translation of Pierre Menard, and they're identical. You have to read them like 6 times to see if he's snuck in some difference. No, they're identical. And he says, of course, the Pierre Menard coming centuries later is far more subtle and enriched by the passage of time. And he says in other places too that the translator's art is arguably, more advanced. Now, I'm not saying that, but I'm saying that the passage of time and the accumulation, the accretion of all these layers we're talking about is also raw material in a way for the translation, for the afterlife. And I guess that's what I'm getting at here, is that in this kind of Benjaminian sense, it's the afterlife of a work that I'm really interested in. Not so much, or not at all, well, no, not so much creating perfect equivalence of an 11th century verse in this case, which is impossible. I mean, that's why Borges writes Pierre Menard. I'm interested in that afterlife, that kind of Benjaminian tangent that extends into the present, into a conference like this.
I think on that score, as we think about Ibn Gabirol, Uriah Kfir is scheduled to be the last formal presenter of the conference, and I think he's going to touch on all of that. The title of his paper, unless he's changed it, is 1,000 Years of Ibn Gabirol.
I saw that, yeah.
So we'll look forward to that.
Yeah.
Maybe we should turn to a reading of a poem, one that was a natural, but also both a dream and a little bit of a nightmare to even think about trying to capture poetically, because so many people have said so much about it among all of Ibn Gabirol's poems. Ahavticha. Why don't you read that for us and then talk about the different ways in which you kind of grappled with that text?
Mm-hmm. So I'm going to just share the screen here so you can all see. Ariel asked that we do that. So before you start reading on the screen, I'm just going to read these in English. I'm sure all of you know these poems extremely well. So I'll read and we'll talk a little bit about some of the things I'm doing. And Ross, feel free to ask away. And likewise from the audience if anybody wants to. I love you. I love you with the love a man has for his only son, with his heart and his soul and his might. And I take great pleasure in your mind as you take the mystery on of the Lord's act in creation, though the issue is distant and deep, and who could approach its foundation? But I'll tell you something I've heard and let you dwell on its strangeness. Sages have said that the secret of being owes all to the all who has all in his hand. He longs to give form to the formless, as a lover longs for his friend. And this is maybe what the prophets meant when they said he worked all for his own exaltation. I've offered you these words. Now show me how you'll raise them. So, yeah, thank you. One of the things when I teach translation, which I love to do and do every year at Yale, and also when I edit, I now edit, co-edit with Rosanna Warren and Richard Seaberth, the series at Princeton that these books came out in, which is also strange twist of fate there. But one of the things I try to convey to students is in the sort of general discussion about translation that takes place with regard to translation from, especially of poetry, from all languages and all periods, is let's just, in a kind of almost sort of jujitsu way, when people come at you and say, oh, but you can't get all those things that are in the Ibn Gabirol poem. It's so complicated, it's so beautiful, it's so layered. And instead of saying, no, I can, you say, you're absolutely right. Shh, let them go in one direction. And I say, okay, so if I can only get one thing, of all those beautiful things, what one thing would I go to the mat, in the Hanagid sense, what would I give up my life for, my time, my literary life for, to get over to the reader? So in a case, in a poem like this, and another way to put that is that Robert Fitzgerald, the great translator of Homer and Virgil into English, said that the translator always has to become very clear about, he called it, what matters most for him, what matters most in the poem. And so in a poem like this, what matters most for me is this deep sense of linkage that's being conveyed in this poem, right? The superscription says, wherever that came from, how much later, but addressed to a student who's asked about the nature of existence. Clearly, it's between some kind of teacher-like figure to someone to whom knowledge is being transmitted, knowledge of a certain kind. There's also the relationship of friendship here that's central, and the erotic dimension of that teacher-student relationship. And so these are all things that come across to me, certainly in reading and just contact with the Hebrew, but of course then in absorbing the history of scholarship around it, which, as you said, is vast. Gadamer, there's a beautiful, so another consideration here is, what is the unit of translation? So Gadamer writes somewhere in one of his essays about translation, is it the word? Is it the phrase? Is it the work? Is it the world into the work in which the work emerges? And he calls that the third dimension. And I would say, yes, it's not just the world into which the work, the original of this emerged, but it's the world into which the translation will emerge as well. And so you go through that tremendously kind of complex folding right? And the word complex etymologically has to do with folds, multiple folds, all that folding to try to emerge with a kind of simple one thing that's about linkage, that's about a relationship that, as with the Hebrew, you could plausibly read to someone and they would feel the immediacy of it. So how do I do that? How is there Arabic in here? And of course you've got Isaiah, and you've got Deuteronomy, and you've got the Shema, and you've got, and then the Gnostics are in here. They're all in there. In a very simple way, I tried to keep the surface very simple, right? Trusting that if I do my job, if I can get that one thing of linkage in the prosody, in the feel and the flow of the English, genetically it would encode a lot of these other things. And let's face it, also when you read these works in Hebrew, not everybody knows what's behind all these things. Some people do, some people don't, and that changes with the generations. I also have nothing against annotation. I very much like annotation. Just keep it at the back of the book so that it's clear that the poem has to stand on itself in English. So simple things, monosyllabic words. I love you with the love a man has for his only son. And again, I don't want to go through this, in a kind of tedious one-to-one fashion, but I'm trying to establish connections, very simple. Man, son, mind, on, creation, foundation, deploying these consonants, these kind of off rhymes, these changing between feminine and masculine stress, all these things that are the tools of poetry. I'm trying to deploy them in the interest of creating a kind of sinuous figure all the way through the poem, one that will involve you in the kind of complicated but immediate sensory sensation, really, that the poet here has and is trying to pass on to the student or express his feelings about that transmission. I think one of the key words here for me is in that fourth line, I take great pleasure. In addition to all that scholarship and learning and absorption of different prosodies that go into a translation, if I can't convey the pleasure that the original has given to me, then there's no flying. Then I feel that I haven't given anything, and that's an underrated, I think, an undervalued value, in the sense of the transmission of pleasure is what this poem is all about. It's a complicated kind of pleasure. It's a pleasure in imaginative, intellectual splendor. But that's what I work hard for, is to try to get that. And so a poem like this, I've read this at literary festivals all over the world in English to people who don't know anything, who've never met Jews, who have no idea about this tradition. And that's one of the things I love about Ibn Gabirol, is that he's both deeply enmeshed in all this stuff, and yet if that whole Judeo-Arabic substratum isn't available, the poetry is still very powerful. So.
That's wonderful. And you're incomparable in reading your own work as well. I don't think, even with some rehearsal, any of us who are native English speakers would be able to convey that in such a powerful way as you did.
Let me just say one thing about that. That too is related to this whole layering we're talking about, because what does Ibn Ezra say in Book of Discussion and Remembrance? What he says, and why the Hebrew poets, and we also have this from the Church Fathers, right, in Christian writings. What is it about Arabic that the Hebrew poets and the Christian youth loved? They loved the sound of it. And Ibn Ezra says that the poem comes in through the ear. And it's that sort of weave of Arabic as it changed Hebrew, not just through the meter, but through the whole manipulation of the surface texture of the Hebrew line. That's something I've wanted in subtle ways to enter into my English, especially in the translations. It sort of rewired my writing as a poet in English too. But so I'm trying to get some of that in the reading out loud as well.
Fabulous. Let me ask you something that I think you and I had talked a little bit about this session, and I've been wanting to ask this to draw the audience into this for discussion later on at the end of this session. But I mentioned that in this group, as far as I'm aware, and I could be wrong because I don't know everyone, but you, Jonathan, and I, and Tova, back in her days at Princeton, might be the only people who both teach this literature in translation to undergraduates with, a lot of the historical and literary apparatus, but also teach it in the original Hebrew. But we're doing it in the context of teaching students at an American university in the English language, even if we're not using translation. And I think this is probably something that differentiates us. It gives us a kind of an advantage, but also a disadvantage from our Israeli colleagues, in that we have to, even when we're teaching it from the original and without translation, in the context of teaching at an American university, we're going to have to somehow commit to what we think the text means, every word maybe. And I don't know what happens in Israel. You mentioned that you had a Targil once way back with Yossi Yahalom. And I wonder, in your memory, what, is there paraphrase? Is there discussion word by word? line by line, when you're doing it only in Hebrew? How does that differ from the experience of working with the same text in the Hebrew language, but having to talk about it in English?
Well, I do kind of come out of the Jerusalem school because I studied a little bit.
Wait a minute. We're at Tel Aviv University right now, so please.
But I have to be honest, I didn't say I didn't evolve. I just said I came out of the Jerusalem school. And also, everything I've done, I had the incredibly intense and generous help of Mati Hus through all of this, and Mati with his teachers, and so I've been the beneficiary of the kind of trickle down Jerusalem school approach. That first targil with Yossi Yahalom it was kind of embarrassing because I was really not that long out of the Ulpan, and was terrified to speak, and I still remember the first paper I wrote was on Shachar Evakeshcha, and I remember Yossi after class calls me up, and he says, "Look, you've misunderstood all kinds of basic things. This is actually Shir Kodesh, right? This is not Shir Chol." He said, "But it doesn't matter." He said, "You'll learn more than anybody else in the class, I'm sure." And I was, kind of happy that he was suffering me, but there was a kind of knowledge in the poem that was transmitted to me before knowledge. Right? It was a knowledge of materiality in the poetry, I think. What your point about teaching it in the States, though, so I didn't have all that many classes in Jerusalem, so I don't really, but I know mostly from my friends how they were taught. Teaching it in the States, at first I thought, well, how am I going to do this? Students are able to respond to the translations because they're reasonably alive. Edward Fitzgerald, the translator of the Rubaiyat, or fabricator of the Rubaiyat, said that better a live sparrow than a dead lion. And, I think at least I have a live sparrow. So you can respond to that. But often, I often have students who are not Jewish, who have never heard Hebrew, are not going to be able to look at this in Hebrew. Sometimes I'll have 12 Jewish students at Yale, all of whom have amazing Hebrew, and we can read in the original. But not usually, and increasingly, last year when I taught this stuff, I had 5 black students in the class, 3 Muslims, the one and a half Jews, who didn't know very much about the tradition. So you are presenting, you have to account for everything, but what I find tremendously encouraging about all that is it gives you a chance to see just how valuable and how incredible this poetry is. The things that we think of as a kind of postmodernism avant la lettre, right? This pasting together of quotation, and where is the person, and where is what you were talking about today with Ibn Gabirol? Where is the person? Where is the persona? The layering of quotation, the hybridity, all these things. But it's a kind of postmodernism avant la lettre with warmth, right? With passion, and especially with Ibn Gabirol. It's without the coolness and the distance. And there's ironizing, but it's ironizing that's like an iron in the fire. So the students respond to that. They see the power and the charge that's available to them in that. And that's a wonderful feeling to have that kind of, let's say, literary strategy validated outside of the identity politics of it all. So I try to teach it with a kind of combination of the way I was taught and learned in Jerusalem, and then the way I like to read poetry in anywhere, any kind of poetry. We bear down on the surface of the text. We play the game. The English is all you have to go with. And I will do my best to fill you in on what's not there. But first we're going to deal with what's there. And I teach them the genres, and I teach them about convention and what does convention mean, and these things that I had to discover for myself, which we take for granted all the time, I think. I remember when I first really began reading this poetry seriously, I didn't understand what convention was. I mean, it was thrown around all the time. This is an ornamental, conventional verse. Where I came from, that was bad news. Like, that's the last thing you wanted to be, was ornamental or conventional. And I had to go back sort of etymologically to all these words and learn also from the history of other disciplines. Art history, what is ornament? In Islamic art history, for example, was a huge, huge help to me. Oleg Grabar, the Indian writer, British Indian art historian Kumaraswamy, writing about non-Western kinds of art and their relationship to convention and to ornament as the equipment, the completion of the kind of equipment of a service or of a rite or of a task of a warrior. And when I began to understand that these are the kind of weapons, these are things to get work done. These are the machines of poetry, convention and ornament in this context. So when you can give that to students, that also feels like a kind of transmission that involves a lot of pleasure, and is maybe an advantage for having come to everything from sort of outside the body of inner knowledge, let's say.
Well, you've given us a different kind of pleasure, and that is all those of us who inhabit this field through your translations, the very concept, the beautiful notion of the dream of the poem. You've found a way to present this as belonging in world literature and world-class literature. In other words, you've taken Shirman's project for an Israeli, a Hebrew-speaking readership, but you've done that now for an English-speaking world, an English-reading world that extends beyond the English-speaking world, making this available so that these poets and their work can take their place in the canons of world literature. We all thank you for that very much. Let's move on to Truth Seekers, if that's okay.
Mm-hmm. So
I think this is only in the dream and not in the selected poems. If I'm
no,
not-
it's in both.
It's in both?
Yeah.
Okay.
But a poem that people might know a little less. I put it actually as the first poem in the Ibn Gabirol section in both books. It seemed to me emblematic of Ibn Gabirol, or at least what I find matters most in Ibn Gabirol. Truth seekers, turn to my poems, and you who are ignorant learn. They'll teach you hidden wisdom and instruct you in all that's arcane. Don't fall for words that are empty and vain, but hold to these poems and you'll hold to faith, for the weak poem kills the soul of its author. While he's still alive, it dies. Where the excellent in memory endures, like the new moon, month by month, in its rise. Somebody earlier, in one of the earlier sessions, was asking about wisdom, right? What is wisdom? And I guess the answer was, well, it's different things in different contexts. And I think this is a perfect example of, I mean, they're all related for Ibn Gabirol, but they turn in different directions at different times. So this poem, apart from being written in the same prosody that all of Ibn Gabirol's mono-rhymed poems are, that deeply Arabized mode, this poem translates, in a sense, a particular line, famous line by Ibn Gabirol, the Arabic poet, pre-Islamic poet, I think, Ross, right?
I think
early
Islamic.
Early Islamic, yeah.
I think 8th century, if I'm not mistaken. I might be wrong.
Yeah, that makes sense. And he's quoted by Ibn Ezra also. And that's the line, essentially, for the weak poem kills the soul of its author, while he's still alive, it dies. And of course, that's a terrifying line. It's a terrifying line no matter who says it. And if it was the 8th century or the 11th century, it was Arabic, it was Hebrew, and Ibn Gabirol just sort of takes it up 3 centuries later and And then he turns it into, he again, in that sort of notion of the fold, he folds it into this, in a very short poem, this complicated matrix of his own fach, his own boasting, his own pride, and as Susan Stetkevich says, of the boast, there always betrays a certain underbelly of anxiety too. There's a certain kind of, I think of them as kind of Norman Mailer advertisements for myself. It's it's the cocaine of poetry. You're getting yourself up for the battle in a certain sense. There's the sort of secular, let's say, literary immortality that's at stake. But then there's again the sense of transmission and preservation, and this simile at the end of likening the poem to the new moon month by month in its rise. So that works on the natural plane of the natural metaphor, the new moon. But it also, obviously, when it's in Hebrew, works on the plane of the Jewish metaphor and what the new moon means in the Jewish context and with relation to the presence of God and the renewal, revival of Shekhinah, and presence in that sense, and kavod. So what this is for me is really, it's a poem about life. It's a poem about the extension of life through generations, through nature, through generations, through poetic convention, a bringing together that is anything but stuffy or conventional. It's a bringing together to increase valence, to reestablish a kind of sense of a vector, and that's a kind of deep reading, deep translation that, for me, drives my translation. Is finding that place in the poem where you're not just translating the words, you're translating some other impulse that is available only in the words. Right? If it was something that was easily, you can separate form and content, and we can talk about the content of the poem. But Yaroslav Stetkevich writes about it. You can say, but form and content, the separability of form and content in the Arabic tradition is actually its inseparability. It's so bound up in the language that what's the point of separating them? And I think of it like food. You can take the nutrients of food, turn them into powder, put them in a plastic bag and send them up into a space station, and you will be nourished for a month or two up in space. But that's not exactly food. Like, you don't want to live that way. There's no pleasure in that, right? And pleasure, again, is a real part of it. So identifying that kind of kernel is really important.
What you say about form and content reminds me of something, it's a little dated now, but I always give it to students who haven't studied poetry before. And that's John Ciardi's How a Poem Means. I think Americans, this is less so among literary people in Israel or the reading public in Israel, but Americans we're taught to be fearful of poetry for some reason. And it's kind of like some kind of foreign discourse that landed, and people are run from it, much preferring fiction of one sort or another. One last thing I wanted to point out about this, because I'm mindful of the other topics we've been discussing. For Ibn Gabirol, Tova Be'eri has written about this wonderfully, that the moon held a very special significance for Ibn Gabirol, and that's probably layered in here as well.
And there's Ani Haish, and yeah.
So let's, I'm conscious of the time, and I know we have at least another 15 minutes, but we want to have some Q&A from the audience. Maybe we can squeeze another 5 minutes or so from them. Omer and Ariel, let me know if I'm wrong, but I really want to get to the garden and your presentation of Badia, because this makes me think of something that I've read about and been thinking a lot about. And it's implicit in some of your earlier discussion. I was really struck by what you said about Ahavticha when you read it totally outside of a Jewish audience context. And people respond to it in whatever ways they respond to it, and different people respond differently. But there's this notion now of historical radiance, and that all too often, where those of us who study any aspect of the past are preoccupied naturally, because we're human, looking for ways in which the past speaks to the present. But when we only look at the past in that way, we're likely to miss many of the ways in which the past is very, very different from the present. And this is true of artifacts that were produced in the past as well. And I think Badia is you mentioned before how you had to learn what convention was. No doubt you had to learn what ornament was as well. So this is a wonderful example of that tension in encountering this poetry as a student, and even more so as a teacher and translator.
Yeah, this poem of Ibn Gabirol's has the superscription, something in which he employs the ornaments, the rhetorical ornaments, and the badia, and makes them subtle, like Ibn Qutayba says something to that effect also. And I remember, again, just it is a kind of poet's naivete of saying, wait a second, everything, the way people talk about ornament in American poetic circles, and maybe pointing back to, at most they would point back to the metaphysical poets, it did not jibe in any way with my experience of the experience I was having reading Ibn Gabirol and the Hebrew poets. And apart from bearing testimony, bearing witness, which I think is one of the things a translator does, Kenneth Rexroth, the American poet and translator from Chinese and Japanese, talks about the translator's job as being one of advocacy, getting something across to the jury also, out of that enthusiasm. So I would just ask people. I had a friend she's now a big shot art historian at Northwestern, I think. And I said, where can I learn about ornament in art? I don't understand. I'm reading all this stuff. I don't get it. I don't understand the way it's being used in a literary context. She said, well, start with Gombrich. And, so I was reading Gombrich's The History of Art, and he's got that other book about sort of ornament and design. And then it's when I got to Oleg Grabar, who has a whole several studies of ornament, which the mediation of ornament is one of the great books I've ever read. It's one of the most important books for me in my reading of Andalusian things. Just as an aside, about 3 or 4 years ago, I had a student at Yale in my twice in translation classes, named Grabar. Her last name was Grabar Sage. The first year, it didn't occur to me to ask. The second year, she was in my advanced class, and she said, "Oh, Professor Cole, could you come? I have an art exhibit, and I've written some poems to it." And so she takes me in, and suddenly I realized, I said, "Miggs, are you related to Oleg Grabar?" And she looks up and she said, "Grandpa, how do you know him?" And I said, "Well, I don't actually. I got a letter from him once." And she said, "Could you tell me why he's so famous?" This was a very smart young woman, but she had no idea. I said, "You have no idea what this person has meant to me." Anyway, he talks about ornament as calophoric. Right? It carries beauty, calophoric. It's a carrier. Again, these are things that do work. These are tools, for the creation of action. And I think of it, how do you make ornament? How do you enact it? How do you bring it into play? So this is probably one of the most famous poems in which this is, quote, demonstrated. I'll just read The Garden. Its beads of dew harden still, he sends his word to melt them. They trickle down the grapevine's stem, and its wine seeps into my blood. The beds blossom and open before us clasps of their whitening buds, sending a fragrance up to our faces as we wander out to the myrtles. As you go, each flower lends you a petal, a wing so you won't crush it. And the sun's face glows like a bride whose jewels shine in her glow. Through its circuit daily she glides, though no one at all pursues her. And so we think it a king's chariot drawn by galloping horses. As it passes over the garden, you notice the beds now coated in silver. And then when the day declines, it lines their border with a shimmering gold. In its sinking soon you find yourself thinking it's bowing before its maker. As it swiftly sets, it seems to be veiled in darkening red by the Lord. So just very, very quickly, the kinds, I mean, there's a zillion ornaments here, and I mapped them out elsewhere, but just the most obvious thing, kind of, and then when the day declines, it lines. Little things like then and when. I always tell my translation students, look for the connective tissue, the dead words. Make sure that these little words, Blake has this great thing, labor well the minute particulars. These are the minute particulars of poetic genetics, really. Make sure they're doing something. They're not just in there inertly. Then when the day declines, it lines their border with a shimmering gold, and more conspicuously, in its sinking soon, you find yourself thinking it's bowing before its maker. That kind of, there's a mixture of instinct and revision a lot that goes into stuff like this. But that's the kind of effect I'm getting where, another thing that happens here is study of Islamic gardens, and particularly Andalusian gardens. There's a guy named James Dickey who's written about this in that big double volume that Salma Jayusi edited on 1492, 500 years later, right? And he writes about archaeology of the gardens and how in Granada it seems that the paths were over the gardens, so that when you were walking through them, you were kind of looking down at the patterns the flowers were making, and the idea was to enmesh the eye in them. And same with these poems. I think they're here. The ornaments are working to enmesh the mind in the workings of the language, so that the physical becomes metaphysical in this Gabirolian sense in particular, and all of it framed in this kind of religious beginning and ending.
Fabulous. I'm conscious of the time, but I know that you wanted to do at least one liturgical poem or devotional poem. So I'm going to let you pick which of those that we've discussed.
All right, I'll do a very short one because we want to hear some questions, or at least give people a chance to ask them. Well, actually, let's do this one. You lie in my palace on couches of gold. So this is basically, again, most of you know this one. The thing that matters most to me in this poem is the sensuality of the non-liturgical, the secular poetry. The deep sensuality, which you don't find quite like this in Ibn Gabirol's. You find it in Hanagid, you find it elsewhere. But having that taken into the liturgical setting in the synagogue. You lie in my palace on couches of gold, Lord, when will you ready my bed for the one with the beautiful eyes you foretold? Why, my fine gazelle, why do you sleep while the dawn rises like a flag over the hills? Ignore the mules and asses and see to your guileless doe. I'm here for one like you, and you for one like me. Who enters my chambers finds my treasure, my pomegranate, my myrrh, my cinnamon, my nectar. So, enough of that.
Gorgeous. Peter would love to have some comments or questions. He covered an awful lot of terrain in a brief period of time, a lot of different kinds of poems. I'd like to think that Ibn Gabirol himself would have enjoyed this. We
That's
won't.
a, that's a tall order.
No, I think he would. I think he would. The more optimistic Ibn Gabirol would say, "Okay, I actually made it." there was a following.
Right. I'll say one thing I didn't talk about, I wanted to talk about, but was also in Keter Malchut and the whole, what is Saj also, right? Is it rhyme prose, as with convention, as with ornament? Getting to some understanding of what that was just so crucial for me in translating that poem as, because when you read it in Machzor or something, or in most editions, and it's set out as prose, I don't hear prose. I hear just a tremendous symphonic movement. And it was, for example, Devin Stewart's article on Saj that really popped that thing open for me. Then there were many others also, but that kind of back and forth, sort of toggling between scholarship and the surface of the poem has really been so important. It's been everything for me.
You remind us that when you're a medievalist, all branches of learning and thought are necessary requirements. I mean, you're not able to say, I'm not interested in the art history of this.
And that's one of the beautiful, that's one of the beautiful, Julie Maysami writes about that very beautifully, about that. That's one of the kind of characteristics of, she's talking about Persian poetry, but not just, she's also talking about the Arabic matrix. Ross, when you said before about the, what do you call it, radiant history or something?
Historical radiance.
Historical radiance.
The person who wrote about this, forgotten her name, was arguing to capture alterity as much as similarity, and that and I'm struck by how you do that in a very interesting way.
Yeah, so two things occur to me. One is when we think about relevance for the present, I also like to think about all poetries. What is the relevance? How does it change our view of the past, right? Because it radiates backwards as well. But on a translational plane, one of the key texts of sort of modern translation studies, and I use it with my students all the time, is Friedrich Schleiermacher's on translating. And he's basically, in part, a biblical hermeneut, but here he's writing about Greek translation. And he's a sort of extreme advocate for what technically gets called foreignization these days. But let's just say bringing out the difference, the alterity. And one of the things that he also says, and he said, you have to either go, the translator either has to move the author to the reader or move the reader to the author, and there's no two ways. It's either one or the other. Now, I don't agree with him that it's either one or the other. But what he does say, he said you really should move the reader to the author. The reader has to do the work in order to introduce alterity. But he says, but to do that artfully and with measure, nobody ever talks about that. To do that artfully and with measure is one of the basically most difficult things in art and in literature to do. And why would anybody actually do that? Because it's just going to make you look bad at some level. You're going to look not natural most of the time. But that artfully and with measure, I think, is the key there. And how do you get that otherness in and yet make it seem like it belonged in the language all along? I mean, that is what a lot of German, I know that Galili Shachar is going to speak tomorrow. And if you're in the audience there today, I'm sorry I missed your talk at Yale. I was very, very curious about that talk, but I was teaching then. But that's something that the Germans did especially well for a while.
Some questions, comments? I'm mindful of the fact that we
see a couple of hands
at the moment are all that stands between these people and Rioja or something.
Right. There were a couple.
Go ahead. You were saying.
I just saw a couple of hands, that's all. So, Francis, did you have something? Or?
Hi, this is Uriah.
Yes, hello.
Hi, Uriah.
Hi. So thank you very much for this fascinating discussion. And I don't have a question, I do have a comment though. And I want to say that as an Israeli, I find that many times when I don't understand a poem, I open Peter's book to see what Ibn Gabirol meant. Because and for me, your really terrific job is not only a translation, but also a very productive, a very fruitful tool to read the Hebrew. So I want to say that that you should know that you are being read not only in American universities, but also in Israelis by scholars of the field.
Well, good. Thank you. And I think part of what that speaks to is inevitably when you translate, there's going to be a kind of simplification, right? I talked again about the folds and the word simplicity and the word simple and the word complex come etymologically from the same thing and to do with folds. And so inevitably when you translate, you have to make these kinds of decisions that Ross was talking about in teaching, and you're going to have fewer folds available to the reader. That doesn't mean that that the genetic material of that stuff isn't in the language. It just may be further down, maybe a little harder to get at, or maybe you need to get at it with some endnotes. Yeah, there's also a kind, not all simplicity is the end of art, right? It's not the simplicity is the ignorance is the bad simplicity of beginning in a certain sense, and simplicity that's gone through complexity, ideally, at least in the original poetry, I think is the end of art. So it's nice to hear that. Thank you.
I think I saw Francesca's hand up a little while ago. Do you still? And then Sarah. You have to unmute.
Francesca is muted, yeah.
Let me see if we can
Chat.
ask her to unmute.
Very much.
There we go.
I wanted to ask you, you gave this very interesting suggestion, quoting Grabar about the ornament as a carrying device, which is extremely accurate, I think, for medieval poetry in general, Hebrew poetry in particular, Arabic as well. And I wanted to ask you, in that sense, how you dealt with rhyme.
Mm-hmm. Yes. Both carefully and with abandon. I dealt with it in different ways at different times. Some of those considerations have to do with the particular poet or even poem involved. Some of it had to do with my own evolution as a translator. So when I began translating, I translated Hanagid. And particularly in his, let's say, all the poems except for the epigrammatic verse, I felt that what mattered most to me about Hanagid, the one thing I wanted to get across was this kind of radical groundedness and tremendous energy and kind of charismatic groundedness, let's say, of him as a sensibility. That seemed to me, what I needed to get across first and most. Anything that was going to interfere with that, was going to compromise that sensation, I would get rid of in a certain sense. So, but it also had to do with myself as a poet. At that point, I was much younger. I had much less control, I think. I was writing in a much more high modernist mode. And rhyme seemed, rhyme was stuffy and dangerous and associated with all the wrong things in American poetry. And so I stayed away from it largely, except when I did the epigrammatic verse. Reading Hanagid's epigrammatic verse, that, the way it clicks shut. Now, I didn't rhyme all of them, but I rhymed a lot of them, in part because, again, it's back to the pleasure. It gave me those epigrams. There's how many? 4,000 or something? I don't know. They gave me so much pleasure. I couldn't believe how good they were as poetry, as mind-blowing poetry. And so there were there were times when I could do it without the rhyme, but I felt I had to try, and I would use off rhyme and slant rhyme, tried to keep it subtle, not always. I mean, I always try to keep it subtle, but sometimes I use full rhyme, and I knew that it was working when some of my let's say high modernist American friends, poet, critic, translators, who have no Jewish soft spot whatsoever. The fact that I'm translating Jewish poetry is like not at all sexy for them. If anything, it's suspect. When they responded to the epigrammatic verse, I thought, okay, I'm doing something right. So that was there. Once I did that with the short poems, when I got to Ibn Gabirol, he is such a poet of symmetries and reflections and inner and outer and contrasts and polarities. I almost want to say bipolarities, but I discussed it with the shrinks. They don't think he was bipolar. Ross was getting at some of that today, and some other people also. There, I felt that I had to work harder, and I really did have to get the symmetry of the line represented much more robustly. And especially with his long poems, that would involve getting also some of the rhyme. Again, not always regular rhyme and not full, and certainly not monorhyme. The monorhyme it's hopeless. I mean, I know people who try that. It just comes off as silly almost all the time, except for if a very short poem. Sometimes you can get monorhyme, but the point is not to fetishize the end of the line. To realize that what's happening, rhyme takes place everywhere in a poem, especially with poets like this. It's just you don't always see where the axis is. So with Ibn Gabirol, I tried to get a little more of that symmetrical rhyme and balance. And also with the later poets, once I think I developed as a poet and could control that better. But again, it would change from poet to poet.
Sarah.
Yeah, thank you both very much for giving us so much pleasure. I wish we had more time of that. I mean, we could all go, I'm sure, to the evening with that and then join with the Rioja or whatever. Of all the things that gave me so much pleasure in this conversation, I want to point out just one thing that you brought to me, at least. And this is your question, Ross, about the difference between teaching in Israel with people who know Hebrew and for whom the access to these poems seems to be easier, and teaching in a different context in English. And your response, Peter, bringing us into your class with Black students and Muslim students and one Jew and a half, it struck me that this is probably closer to the context in which Ibn Gabirol was writing his poetry than our own Israeli, rather homogenic context. And I think that I thank you for this reminder, because we think of Ibn Gabirol as if we try to identify very presumptuous. And I think that this is an aspect that is important to bear in mind, that he moved in a less homogenic society than we do. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for that, Sarah. I think that also goes back to what Ross mentioned with the title of that anthology, The Dream of the Poem, which was taken from something that Mahmoud Darwish said in Khadarim, right, the Israeli literary journal, where, again, in this sort of postmodern sense, he thought of Andalusia as the place of poetic possibility. And I think maybe even more articulate about that was Adonis, a talk he gave at Dartmouth. I've never seen that talk actually in a book or anywhere, but it was in some article where he talks about the kind of structural power of these Andalusian, the porousness of its borders, And yeah, it's incredibly appealing. So thank you for reminding me of that too.
Because of the internet, and this may be difficult for some folks to feel comfortable connecting with Israeli scholars, although they really should. And I've provided, so I have people in Tunisia and in particular Algeria and Morocco who are studying medieval Hebrew poetry. I mean, they've studied Arabic poetry, and I've never met them personally. They're internet students or colleagues. And they've fallen in love with Ibn Gabirol and Ibn Ezra and the Nagid. And their scholarship is somewhat rudimentary. I wouldn't ever say that to them, but I'm taken that we're creating a virtual world that you're speaking about, Sarah, that is more like the world that Ibn Gabirol inhabited. And would that we could do this not so virtually and more consistently.
Ross, I know everybody wants to go, but I just have to say two things. It's irresistible about what Sarah said. One of my students last year is a Sudanese woman. And about halfway through the semester, I said to her, Fatma, she had just come back from spring break. I said, what do your parents say about you taking this class? She said, my father is he said, finally you're studying something useful at Yale, Muwashachat. Yeah,
oh, no.
Yeah, that's one thing.
Of all the things, he thought that was useful.
Well, because he knows the Muwashach tradition, right? As a student. No, just he's a Sudanese an educated Sudanese. And so, yeah. But the second thing is, I was once at a conference. I was at a literary festival in Hong Kong. And there were several Arabic speaking poets, language poets from different parts of the world, one from Palestine, one from Morocco. And I ended up, in those days, my Arabic was a lot more fluent, my spoken Arabic. I ended up speaking to the Palestinian, we hit it off. And then one night I was in the dining room and at the hotel, eating by myself, and I hear, they're all speaking Arabic over in the corner, and I thought, I didn't want to interrupt them. And suddenly I hear, they call me over, Biter, and come sit with us. And I thought to myself, now I'm going to have to speak standard, Fusha for the next 2 hours. I don't know if I can really do that at this point. So it was the Palestinian guy, Rassan Zaktan, very important poet, a Moroccan poet, and a Uyghur teacher of Arabic. And I discovered that the Moroccan poet was putting together an anthology of North African Andalusian verse. And we started to speak about this, and he got very excited. I got excited. And Rassan from Ramallah didn't really know that thing. And the Moroccan poet hit him and said, Ya Habibi, listen to this Yehudi. He will teach you your tradition. And I thought only in Hong Kong could this take place. on that Andalusian displaced note. We should stop probably. Yeah.
Well, thank you all for participating, listening. Peter, thank you. It was just glorious. Your insights and the beautiful way in which both you render the text and the way in which you talk about it and guide us to your work and to rethink how we approach the work in the original is just so enriching. We're really in your debt. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you, Omer and Ariel, for organizing.
Thank you so much for establishing Tel Aviv Shel Mala there in Zoom. We here in Tel Aviv Shel Mata, in the sub-lunar world, will have to take care of our bodies. So the participants of the conference are very much invited to dinner. And again, thank you both for such a wonderful ending of this day.
Bye-bye. So long, Peter.